The biggest crisis between America and the Soviet Union, the closest that both countries came to a full-blown nuclear war, was in 1962. It was seen as the fallout of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. In response, the Soviet Union had moved a bunch of nuclear-enabled missiles to Cuba at the very periphery of America. The then US President John F. Kennedy was taken aback. He pushed back at the then Soviet President Nikita Khrushchev, who had reached a secret agreement with Cuban leader Fidel Castro. As per that agreement, the Soviet Union would place nuclear-enabled missiles in Cuba. The US imposed a blockade of Cuba. They threatened to invade the island. The standoff lasted for quite a few days in October of 1962, and eventually the Soviet Union relented after a deal between Kennedy and Khrushchev. On Crux Decode this week, is America pushing Russia towards nuclear war? The recent statements coming in from Western leaders, from Jake Sullivan to Antony Blinken to Liz Truss, all of them talking about making Russia pay, talking about liberating all of Ukraine. All of this is seemingly having the opposite effect. It is making Russia more and more belligerent, and that is what we'll explore on Crux Decode this week. US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was the first off the block. He's recently said that the West's goal was to weaken Russia to the point where it could no longer invade or threaten its neighbors. A day later, the British Junior Defense Minister James Heappey, he said it would be completely legitimate for Ukraine to use Western weapons to strike inside Russia if need be. But the most belligerent of all of these was from British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, who recently said that countries opposed to Russia's invasion of Ukraine must double down on their support, including by supplying heavy weapons, tanks, and planes to Ukraine. She was basically telling the West to put their money where their mouth is. The problem is this: the West is now shifting the goalposts, because initially, when the war began, the aim of the West was to simply get Russia to stop the invasion of another sovereign country, to stop the fighting immediately so that both countries could get back to peace. Now, though, the West, through its actions and more importantly through its statements, is ensuring that that very peace which everybody wants will remain more and more elusive, because Russia is being pushed to a corner, and when big powers are pushed to a corner, they retaliate, or at least they threaten to, like Russia has been recently saying. In fact, in recent days, Russia has reported what it says are a series of attacks by Ukrainian forces on Russian regions which border Ukraine. Russia has warned that such attacks risk a significant escalation of the conflict. Ukraine, meanwhile, has not directly accepted responsibility for these attacks, but it says that these incidents are, quote-unquote, payback. In the West, they are openly calling on Kiev to attack Russia, including with the use of weapons that have been received from NATO countries. Russia has responded to this by saying, "Do not test our patience." The United States, on the one hand, has ruled out sending its own or even NATO forces to Ukraine, but at the same time, Washington and its European partners have been supplying heavy-duty weapons to Kiev. Drones, howitzer, heavy artillery, anti-aircraft Stinger and anti-tank Javelin missiles. Initially, it was only defensive military equipment, but as this military operation continues, the weapons that are being provided are turning out to be far more aggressive, far more attack-oriented, and not necessarily defensive weapons. The total US security assistance since this invasion began on the 24th of February amounts to $3.5 billion. And that's not all. The US President Joe Biden has asked the US Congress recently to approve another $33 billion in military aid. Just wrap your head around that figure, $33 billion of military aid to Ukraine. Now, in the latest round, Joe Biden announced a further $800 million of military supplies, including 70-odd howitzers, about 150,000 artillery rounds. And just this past week, we've had both Germany and the UK agreeing to supply armored anti-aircraft artillery vehicles to keep Russia's air force at bay. Now, this is the first time Germany has agreed to provide this type of anti-aircraft tanks, this kind of heavy weaponry to Ukraine. The Gepard systems, they were phased out from active duty in Germany back in 2010, but now Germany is making an exception from its past policy of non-interference to now actively arming Ukraine and its troops. Britain too has agreed to send at least 120 armored vehicles. 80 of them are protected mobility vehicles. The British Army says they are designed to be used in combat, combat support, and combat service roles. And Russia is responding with the exact opposite effect. For example, Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, recently warned that if someone intended to intervene in the ongoing events from the outside and create strategic threats for Russia, that is unacceptable to Russia, and those countries need to know that Russia's retaliatory strikes will be lightning fast. That was followed up by the foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, who recently said that NATO was, in a sense, engaged in a war with Russia through a proxy, and it was actively arming that proxy. This is the same interview where Lavrov also warned of the risks of a third world war and possibly even a nuclear conflict. And all of this is forcing Russia to raise the nuclear rhetoric. We had Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, saying that nuclear weapons could be used as an absolute last resort, to even Sergei Lavrov saying that Russia and the United States could bring about World War III if things don't calm down. In fact, Vladimir Putin himself, the president himself, has said that tactical nukes could be deployed. The rhetoric from Moscow has been shrill, and it's been rattling the nuclear saber in a way that we haven't seen Russia do in a number of years. Russia could also cite the ICJ ruling. Remember, the ICJ is a bit ambiguous when it comes to the use of nuclear weapons, particularly if it is an existential threat, if the very existence of a state or a people is threatened. So Russia can resort to nukes if it were an existential threat to the further continuation of the Russian state and the Russian people. In fact, the ICJ had said way back in 1996 that the threat or use of nuclear weapons would be generally contrary to the rules of international law that is applicable in armed conflict, and in particular the principles and rules of humanitarian law. However, in view of the current state of international law and elements of fact at its disposal, the International Court cannot conclude definitively whether the threat or the use of nuclear weapons would be lawful or unlawful in an extreme circumstance of self-defense in which the very survival of the state would be at stake. But this would mean total annihilation. There are those who still view Russian comments on the nuclear question as being forced by NATO. NATO says it's not at war with Russia, but it's hard not to conclude that the West is engaged in this proxy fight because of the continuing and ongoing arms supply, which is only getting heavier and which is only getting deadlier with each passing day.